a lot of the accountability conversation can go towards this debate that a lot of people bring up of individual versus collective / systematic action. Like, which one is more important? Can one exist without the other? And for me, I feel as though, for instance, there is no collective or systematic action without individual action. So I'd love to hear your idea on this dichotomy, on this debate, and what advice you give to folks that might be struggling with this, struggling to hold themselves accountable, to do what they can, while also understanding that we live in a context that shouldn't exist, and it's an unfair dynamic, while holding institutions or governments, our politicians accountable. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I couldn't have said it better than you did, and I've been waiting for someone almost to reflect that back to me forever, what this struggle between each of them are and how interconnected they were. And for a long time, I think I used to find the idea of individual action triggering. I used to find it like, oh, it's a distraction, it's a shame tactic, it's a way to kind of put blame on the individual and recreate the systems of capitalism when really there's a system that's rigged against people. But actually, before we can take collective action, we have to hold ourselves accountable and we have to do our own work. And I think, that's both for climate change, both for racial injustice. Like, what is the role that we're playing in reproducing systems of capitalism or systems of oppression? And so when you've done that personal reckoning, you can then think about collective action and systemic action. I've talked for ages, but I just want to say one thing, which is I had a brilliant conversation last year with an environmentalist and someone who's like, I don't think they'd mind me saying, of like the older generation of environmentalists, and one of the people that we owe to this conversation, Bill McKibben, who wrote one of the first books for mainstream consumption on climate change in 1989. And I asked him a similar question, and he said, one of the biggest acts of resistance that we can be a part of and in sort of tackling capitalism is to be in community. To make sure that everything we do is about being in community and doing things with other people, because that's the antithesis of this system that forces us to be individuals. And every time we act in community, we're giving birth to, a future system. And so even if you want to do something as an individual, think about how you can do it with someone else, how you can build community through that action. And then if we're doing that's an act of resistance in and of itself. And I think that's a way to change individual action to be part of systemic action.
Absolutely. And also on that point, community is a survival mechanism. In the face of a natural disaster, you have to lean on your neighbors. You need community resilience to be able to live in a climate world. So leaning on your neighbor and taking that into account and understanding that as a form of climate action and deconstructing that idea is so important, not only in regards to us building this new world, but also surviving all these new dynamics that we're living in. So I'd love to hear a bit about the accountability conversation from one of you as well.
I mean, I can just maybe add to what you're saying, Fatima. Community kind of grounded work is absolutely essential in environmental injustice work and for an environmentally unjust future as well. And I think, it works in unison, working on your individual character and on kind of systemic change. And when you think about, okay, what makes a good community, it's very much about the different characteristics of those people in it. They have to be kind and compassionate and empathetic. And so those also are the kind of characteristics that we have to develop within ourselves in order to be a good community member. And, outside of that, they all work in unison. And I think it's very easy to kind of try to think of everything as a step, First, we do this, and then that, and then finally we'll be just. But this world is so complex that everything has to be working in parallel. And just, I think, accepting that is very important because it can be overwhelming to think, where do I start? What do I do? We're not getting to where we need to be, but just knowing that it takes time and that's okay. And as long as we're all intentional, then we're going in the right direction. So I think.
Laura, I want to ask you a specific question in this regard because we had the opportunity to all hop on a Zoom call and we ended up all bonding, which is really amazing. And something that you brought up was the historic context of the corporations, the historic context of capitalism in really perpetuating and pushing out this debate in the first place. So I'd love for you to provide some context to all of the folks tuning in and watching on why systematic action is so important, why it's important to, yes, hold ourselves accountable, while also understanding that the dynamics that we find ourselves in could have been avoided. It was a context in which people and corporations decided to place profit over people every time, and how that ties to the colonial legacy that we find ourselves in, and therefore why we have to take ourselves out of that.
Okay, so the initial question was actually if there was like a division between individual and collective action, and I will say that there's no division. One thing about the Western system is that they made us believe that we can make things alone, that we think alone, that we create things alone, that everything that we, like, what I'm saying right now is not just because I'm intelligent and that's it. It's because we have talked, we have read, we have worked with our own community. So everything that we do and like actually we decide, it has a collective influence and it has a collective impact. The thing also now is that with globalization and like all these international spaces and spheres and dynamics is that, I don't know, if you decide to do something, you think that it won't have an impact because you are not seeing it, but like me living in London in the last year, like London is a pretty comfortable city, but I don't think that the people see that that comfiness is about also, or is at the expense also of, for example, migrants in London, or even like in a more huge scale, it can be also about exploiting people in other continents as Africa, Latin America, and also exploiting natural resources, of course. And actually, accountability also is not at the local scale, but here in this like in these cities as London, which is huge and they have so many power. It's also about like asking yourself what they are doing with the money, because here the people have a lot of money, but like for example in Colombia, we are not given the money, we are given something which is even more important, that is life, like life through ecosystems, through like the water, and life with the people also, because for example Colombia is the most dangerous country to be an environmental defender, but it's not just because, like, it has also like a huge international background that is related to like this confidence also.